during the afternoon sessions, we got a real gem. Y'all may already know this gentleman. His name's Francois Vanderwatt. And first of all, he talks funny, but I'm going to tell you something. This guy he's a gem in Arkansas, truly a gem, because he does some things worldwide that very few people do. And he's really a star in rehabilitation world. Sounds kind of nerdy, I know, but it's true. Francois provides general, prosthetic, and orthotic care to patients of all ages and functional levels, but he specializes in high performance sport and activity prosthetics. And he's part of the U.S. Paralympic track and field team, has been a member of that since 2011. And he's had the strict duty of having to go to Paris for the last one, so he's just coming back from that. So everybody give Mr. Vanderwatt a nice warm welcome.
Hi, Danny. Thank you for the warm introduction. I want to say thanks to UMS for having me here. It's a privilege to be back in Arkansas. It's more of an informational session. I know it's a tough session after lunch, and that turkey sandwich is drawing the eyes closer. So hopefully you can bear with me. And really excited just to share some information that came about in Arkansas. So Arkansas, and statistically, a lot of times when it comes to healthcare, we're kind of at the bottom of the barrel. So one thing that happened over the last year and a half in Arkansas is where we're on top of the bottom of the barrel. So, and that is so everybody can move. If you're not familiar with this, it's actually an act that was implemented in Arkansas on the state level. And if you bear with me, I'm going to go through this and kind of inform you what happened and what hopefully will contribute to more people getting active in the country. Just a quick disclosure here. I'm the owner of Vanderwatt Prosthetics and Orthotics in Greenwood, Arkansas. I'm also a part-time instructor for the DPT program. I'm sorry. I need to advance this. There we go. I'm also a part-time instructor at the DPT program at the Arkansas College of Health Education in Barling. And then non-financial relationships, I'm a member of the Arkansas Licensure Advisory Board for Prosthetics, Orthotics, and Perorthotics, where we review licensures for OMP practitioners. And then also a member of the American Academy of Orthotics and Prosthetics. Just want to kind of take a step back and look back what happened so far when it comes to people living with disabilities. So as most of you would know, in 1990, President George Bush Sr. signed the American Disability Act into law. So we're looking at a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination based on disability in employment in the state and local governments, prohibit discrimination in public accommodations. So if we see new building codes coming up where we need to have ADA accessible ramps or bathrooms, this is because of the ADA Act. And that comes into the commercial facilities where no discrimination can take place with someone with a disability. And then in transportation, telecommunications.
It's not all free.
Is that better? Better, all right. So also, we're looking at prohibit discrimination against transportation and telecommunications. So that's why we have the Braille on the phones, so people that's blind can read or feel the numbers. And transportation, having seating on a bus that allows for a wheelchair to have a room for someone to use. And as Danny mentioned, I just returned from Paris, and if anyone ever been to Paris, they are not ADA compliant. Cobblestones doesn't work well with wheelchairs. They don't have stairs or ramps that accommodate for stairs. And obviously, because Paris is a very old city, so new construction will account for making it more accessible. And just a quick tidbit, during the Olympic and Paralympic Games, the Team USA had what we call Team USA House. It's a facility that they rent out for all the Olympian and Paralympic team members, as well as their family members, to have a social area where they can meet and relax and have some alone time just with friends and family. But the USOPC, they had to build a ramp for that building specifically for the games. There was no ramp, so it wasn't wheelchair accessible. So they had to do that, and that's part of the whole delegation to make that accessible. One thing that is interesting, I found interesting with going through this was that annually, and this was in 2011, they looked at how many amputations worldwide is taking place annually, and we're looking at about 356 million amputations. Now, that's not just below knee or above knee, that is all kinds of amputations. So if you lose a toe digit or a finger, that will count in that number. But if we bring it a little bit closer to home, in the US, there's an estimate that about 1.6 million people live with amputation or limb loss. And that was in the year 2005. And the projection is that by 2050, we're looking at 3.6 million people living with limb loss. So we can see there's going to be and we see it on a daily basis, that there is a uptake in how many people is going to live with limb loss. The challenge, though, is when we look at what is the rehabilitation cost, and since you guys most all are in rehabilitation, the healthcare cost, and this was not recently, it was about 2011, they estimated just over $500,000 for the lifetime. Now, the projected cost would include the rehab time, the amputation, the cost of the hospital where the amputation was done, rehab time to get someone back to wearing a prosthetic, the prosthetics that they're using. So over their lifetime, we're looking at $500,000. The one thing that I found interesting is that 42% of patients reported being unable to work for 7 years following their lower limb amputation. That's separating the financial and psychological burden. As we know, going through amputation is a traumatic event. So psychologically, how do we overcome that? And we also know it's not just the physical aspect that they have to deal with, but it's also the psychological aspect. It's like losing a family member. It's part of you that you lose. And I can see if it's an event where it's a traumatic amputation, someone's in a motor car accident, and the limb gets severed at the scene, that's even worse on their psyche than if someone knows, I have diabetes, I have an infection, I got 2 or 3 days, but we're going to lose this limb. So they can start that process a little sooner than someone who got caught by surprise in an accident that sometimes is not even their fault. So that is a big burden on an amputee. But one thing that we realized, am I missing my slides? One thing we saw is that although we have the ADA in place, we see that there's still discrimination when it comes to people living with limb loss. And the way we find that discrimination is through insurance coverage for prosthetic limbs. Where an insurance company would look at a secondary or an additional prosthetic as not a medical necessity. So we see people who have limited access to additional orthotic and prosthetic devices. So and for you who might be wondering, yes, that is Hunter Woodall from the Razorbacks. And that was at a training session before he won the gold medal in the 400 almost a week ago. So when we look at someone, not just at that level, everyone think about, what is accessible or what is an activity prosthetic if we get to that point. It's not just the high-level athletes we're looking at. And that's where we come to how can we as a community on the OMP side, we believe, and I think most, if there's therapists in the room, most of us believe that movement is medicine, and physical activity is a right and not a privilege. And the title of this session is So Everybody Can Move, and that's where this all ties in. We think people with a disability who are physically active, they are more likely to be employed. If they're physically active, they're more likely to advance in their careers if they're employed. And if they're physically active, we also see that there's an improvement in the physical and mental health. So that brings us to so everybody can move. So what is so everybody can move? If we look back, and the ADA came in effect in 1990, here we are, 2024. If we look past 30 years, nothing really happened to look at secondary prosthetic care for amputees. And the American Orthotic and Prosthetic Association had a grassroots initiative where we were looking at how can we, on a state-by-state basis or in the state legislative process, how can we change that perception of that a secondary or an activity prosthetic is a luxury from the insurance perspective, or it's not medically necessary. So what we're looking at then is how can we expand that access for the necessary OMP care? Anyone playing golf? Anyone playing pickleball? Anyone use a boat for the summers? Up to now, we expect amputees to use one prosthetic if they go to their work, the same prosthetic if they want to play with their kids, the same prosthetic if they want to go for a weekend on the boat or on the lake, the same prosthetic if they want to do any sport activity. And this is where the So Everybody Move movement came about, is you don't use the same tennis or golf shoes going to work. You have different options. So why do insurance companies limit the options for amputees? And with this legislative process, that's how we want to change that narrative. So how did it start? Jordan Simpson, she is a social worker that's an amputee, congenital amputee, that lived in Maine. And through her childhood, growing up, wanted to play sports, she has to use the same prosthetic for all the activities she want to do. She want to go play with her friends, she want to run track. She only had limited access to one prosthetic. So she came after school, she started looking at, so why is that? So in Maine, she met Representative Colleen Madigan, who is the state representative, and they had a conversation. So they looked in, and in 2022, the state of Maine passed the bill LB 1003, which is an act to improve outcomes for persons with limb loss. So what that act actually did for people in Maine, or children in Maine at this point, is they require commercial insurance companies to cover activity prosthetics for children under the age of 17. So now a kid growing up, what does kids want to do? They want to play. They want to play with their buddies. They want to play with other kids. They want to be active. They want to be outside. So why do we limit them to do that? If you have to go run track in your dress shoes, you're not going to really want to do it. So what do? You opt not to do it. So we want to change that. So with the Maine, that was the first bill in the country that was passed to actually now require insurance companies to pay for activity prosthetics. So in Arkansas, and this is where we now looking at what happened here, are there any insurance company representatives in the room? Thank you. I can speak freely then. So in Arkansas, in August 22, after I learned about the bill that passed in Maine, I had a conversation with Representative Lee Johnson. He's an emergency care physician. If you're out of the Fort Smith area, you might know him as your state rep. And so we had a conversation about this high activity or activity prosthetics for people living with limb loss. And like anything else, sometimes you talk to a politician and it's a nice conversation and you move on. You don't think anything's going to happen. So Dr. Johnson actually took it to heart. And he introduced the House Bill 1252 in January 23 in the House to modify the Arkansas Healthcare Commercial Act and to require coverage for prosthetic devices for athletics and recreation, and prosthetic devices for showering and bathing. So Arkansas already had a parity law where it is required to provide prosthetic care for amputees, but we didn't have activity-specific prosthetics included. We didn't have orthotics for activity included. And additionally, we were able to add for bathing and shower prosthetics. Now you think, well, what are we going to use for, why would you need a bathing or shower prosthetics? Where's the majority of falls taking place in the home? It's going to be in the shower. Think about it, amputee, one leg. Who wants to sit in a chair all the time to take a shower? And it's not so much just standing to take a shower, it's to getting in and out of the shower. You're on a wet surface. What's the first thing that happens? You slip and slide. What's the second thing that happens? You land on your prosthetic or on your limb. Now we go back into the OR. Now we get back into the rehab. So you can see what cost it's going to be for just having a prosthetic. Be able to transfer in and out of the shower, in and out of the bath, in the house. So that, to me, I'm very happy that we were able to get the recreational and activity devices, but I'm more excited about this shower and bathing prosthetics. Because we look at the really people at the level that they're going to compete, or even if they're just going to do recreational activities, it's a much lower or smaller percentage than everyone wants to bath, hopefully daily. Everyone wants to be around water. So that is, to me, the biggest issue was getting that included. So luckily, Dr. Johnson was able to convince Senator Missy Irvine to introduce the bill into the Senate. So anyone familiar with the legislative process? It can be lengthy, but this was short. But there's so many steps that the bill has to go through, and I had to kind of self-learn how this was going to take place. So when a bill is introduced on the floor, then it has to go refer to a subcommittee that will discuss, and then if they approve it, then it goes back to the House. They will vote on it, and then it goes back to the Senate, gets introduced in the Senate. The Senate has to vote. It gets referred to in this case was the Commercial Insurance Subcommittee. The committee discussed and decided if that's going to be put back into the Senate for a vote. In both cases, the Senate and the House voted on it, and we were happy in April 22 that Governor Huckabee was able to sign the bill. And it went in effect July of 2023. So we're looking now at just past a year of this bill being active in the state. But unfortunately, not a lot of people, or amputees specifically, know about this, know about their right, that they have the option, if they're active, if they're a weekend warrior, if they want to play with their kids, if they want to go to the lake, that they have an option that they don't have to use their everyday prosthetic. They have an option to have a secondary prosthetic. And then more important for me is the option to have regardless, have a shower or bathing prosthetic. So what everybody can movement, what they have done so far, if you look at the snapshot here from our map, so all the states in purple, that's where there's active legislation implemented. So those states approved. Some of them are being active since January this year. The orange states are the orange states are the ones that's approved. So that is active law in those states. So you're looking at Arkansas being the first one in the country, because that was in 23. The other oranges ones, I want to say Colorado and New Mexico, they were approved in 23, but they were not implemented until January 24. So Arkansas was the first state that actually had it on the state law that required insurance companies to pay for this. So that is the number one for Arkansas. But the purple states are the ones that is actively looking at legislation. They introduced the bills, and now they just have to go through that process of getting the Senate or the houses to approve it and then get it through their legislative process so they can come up for signing. And then the yellow stages are the ones that now is looking at how can we get involved with this movement and how can we now introduce the bill. So they are actively in the process trying. The biggest thing with any law is you have to have a sponsor. In our case, Dr. Johnson was our sponsor. And that's the hardest thing with anything in this legislative process is finding a sponsor that believes in your cause. And then secondary is to have the support that they can find a path through. Now, it's much harder. Some of the states never had a parity law on the books. So creating a law is much harder than just amending a law that's already existing. So Arkansas, we already had a parity law that allowed for prosthetic care. Some of the states don't have that. So they have a much harder time to find bipartisan support to get it through a House or a Senate. But it is a continuous process. And the end goal of this movement is to get to 28-28. So if you're familiar with the Paralympic movement, the next Paralympic Games is going to be in Los Angeles, in LA 28. So what AOPA tried to do is to see if we can have 28 states by 28 that will cohort with the Paralympic Games to get everybody so they can move. And that is the end, not the end goal. The end goal is 2028, but beyond that is if we can have the whole country have this legislation on state level, we can push it up and go into the federal level so that we can make it similar to the ACA Act or the ADA Act, that it can be a federal law that can't discriminate against amputee for having a secondary or activity prosthetic. So what's going on next? So what does the Act 805? So House Bill, once it became signed into law, it turns into an act. So for Arkansas, Act 805. What it covers is the OMP devices, orthotic and prosthetic devices for athletics or recreation. It also covers the shower and bathing prosthetics, but it also has a restriction that the coverage or the provisions can't be more restrictive than any other provision that someone might need. So the big thing is that if someone's getting an MRI, they're getting any other treatment, they can't exclude prosthetic care over that treatment. So what a health benefit plan can do is they have to be able to provide this service to their members. They have to be issued and contracted in the state of Arkansas. There can't be any limits on the coverage of the plan, so they can't cut them out and say, oh, we only pay for your everyday prosthetic, but we're not going to do for the activity prosthetic. So that can't be allowed. And up until 2023, when this was passed, that happened on a daily basis. Insurance company would hold the purse, so they would detect, or they would determine the health care for their member. So they would deny them any additional prosthetic care. And then lastly, in this bill, we're looking at the cost associated with this can't be less than the Medicare allowable. So insurance company can't say, if you're familiar with DME or orthotic prosthetic billing, we go off the HIPAA coding system, which allow for L codes that we use, which is a federal Medicare billing system. So insurance company can't go and say, well, this prosthetic is going to cost X amount, we're only going to give you Y amount. They have to be at the level of Medicare. So from the insurance part, they don't like to spend more money. They like to make more money, but they don't like to spend more money. So the way we can limit what they can do and not do for the amputees is they can still require prior authorization, like any other procedure. Like if they need prior authorizations to get an MRI, or they need prior authorization to get an everyday prosthetic. That same process is going to be in place. And they are allowed to impose co-payments, deductibles, similar to what they would in any other condition. It's just they can't discriminate anymore and limit someone to have access to an additional prosthetic. And if they do, we also have the insurance commissioner in our side that can adopt necessary rules to enforce this act. And unfortunately to say, we had to pull that card a few times, where we have to file a complaint against the insurance company because of their verbiage, it's not medically necessary, which we don't agree with. So that is also something if you work with amputees or you know amputees, the insurance commissioner is always a helpful tool in supporting any claim that the insurance company might deny. So if you're not familiar with the process when it comes to prosthetic care, I just want to give you a quick recap. So in Arkansas, the device has to be prescribed by an Arkansas licensed physician. It can be an MD, DO, DPM. And the device has to be provided by an Arkansas licensed orthotist prosthetist. So that is because it's an Arkansas law, that's what we fight for in Arkansas. Now, like anything, nothing is done until the paperwork is done. So, because we work off a referral from a prescribing physician, we're going to need documentation from that physician to support the medical necessity for that device. So, typically when it comes to specific activity prosthetics, we're going to look at a functional outcome test. Now, there's a lot of different outcome tests out there. If there's therapists in the room, you might be familiar with the AMP-PRO or the AMP-NO-PRO is the amputee mobility predictor for prosthetic use or no prosthetic use. That's a typical one that we would use. And if you're familiar with how functional levels work, in Medicare, every patient or amputee can be classified at their physical ability, how functional they can be. So there's 4 functional levels, 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1 is someone that's lower functional level, so they can do transfers. Functional level 2 is someone that walks with an assistant device, but is a single speed ambulator, so they can walk just at 1 speed. Functional level 3 is someone that has variable cadence, that we say is so they can walk a normal everyday speed, and then they can walk faster. They can overcome some environmental obstructions like climbing stairs, getting over a curve. And then functional level 4, that's typically where we look at our children and our higher level amputees, active amputees. They're at the functional level. So it's beyond normal locomotion or normal walking. I try not to, I'm sorry. I just get excited. So looking at our functional test outcomes, so there's variable outcomes out there that we can use, and typically in my practice I would have that conversation with the physician so that we can be on the same page. I like to educate them on functional levels if they're not familiar with that. And then we're looking from the physician side, what's the medical history of the patient? What is their previous experience with using orthotic prosthetic devices? If they have used an athletic or recreational device, what is the history there? What is the status of the musculoskeletal system? Because that's what's going to be involved. And then if there's any other medical conditions that needs to be noted. But an important part of that whole process is, the first thing is an amputee need to have the desire to ambulate and have a desire to use the athletic device. We've seen that unfortunately a lot of times people get a device and they wear it in the office and they go home and they put it in the corner, put it in the closet and never use it again. So we have to make sure this is really something they want to use. A lot of people now with social media and what is out there see all these TikTok videos and Instagram things out there with people using prosthetics, and the Paralympics was just a week ago. So people are aware, and sometimes they think that's what they need. They have to be a Paralympic athlete to have access to this. And it's not necessarily that. That is such a small percentage. If you look at the USA team that went to Paralympics, there was 55 members on the track and field team. Out of the 55, there was only 15 amputees. Now, if you look at the whole country, 15 amputees qualified to go to Paralympics. So it's a very, very small percentage that's at that high level. But what about our weekend warriors? What about the guy who wants to play a nice round of golf? What about someone who wants to go play tennis or pickleball is now the big thing? Why do we limit them? If that's something they can do, that's what we want to do. So lastly, we're looking at the patient quality of the Medicare levels. We talked about the functional levels. So it has to be for an activity prosthetic. It's going to be a functional level K3 or K4. For the shower prosthetics, we typically, because it's just for that in-the-house environment, so they're going to have small steps, transfers, so we're looking at the functional level K2 for the shower prosthetics. So for the activity prosthetic, can they achieve a higher level of activity? And then if there's the ability to perform above and beyond normal locomotion or ambulation. So if there's any PM&R docs in the audience, I'd love to talk to you to see if we can push this a little bit further. I have a few ideas. But with all of that, I thank you for your time, and I will take any questions. Yes, ma'am.
So in order for Medicare patients to qualify, like for
No, that doesn't, no. We can still, yeah, Medicare, yep, for sure, yeah. We have a few patients, Medicare patients that went through.
How hard is it to get through for Medicare patients?
It's the normal process, yeah. It's, I mean, typically with Medicare, it's what the relationship is between the physician, the referring physician, and the prosthetist. Having all the dots checked, all the boxes checked, looking at the notes to justify the necessity. Someone for a shower prosthetic, if they had past experience falling in a shower or tripping, or just their anxiety, they don't want to go into the shower because they're afraid. We pay a lot of attention to the fall statistics, how many times we fell, but I don't think we pay a lot of attention to the near falls. Oh man, that is as scary as an actual fall, is that near fall. So psychologically, that is a big thing when it comes specifically to shower and bathing, is not just preventing a fall. We don't want to have the trauma of someone accidentally, because they reactive when they fall and they put their limb down and they bust it open again. But that near fall moment, that's what we want to prevent.
Hey,
Yes, ma'am.
I've never heard of a shower prosthetic.
Oh, yeah? Welcome.
What's the difference? I mean,
So it's allowed for, it's corrosive resistance, so the components that we use just allow it to be in a wet environment. It's not going to rust, it's not going to, so we typically use componentry that's more conducive for a wet environment.
are normal people like Hanger and all them can get that for us?
Supposed to. Yep, no, it's supposed to, and unfortunately, that's why I appreciate this opportunity that you can go to, if you know of a O&P provider and you work with a patient, that they can approach the provider and say, hey, this is a law in Arkansas. It's my right. If I meet the criteria, I should be able to get this. So, and that's just going to, unfortunately, depends on the individual practice, how they can approach it. Yes, ma'am.
Can you repeat the questions so everybody can?
I didn't hear that question. Correct. Yep. It's on state level, so yeah. Just show of hands. Anyone work on with amputees on a kind of weekly, daily? Perfect.
So what has been your experience with the pediatric population, and have you had good success with, as the children grow, being able to get them what they need through this new law?
Correct. So yeah, pediatric is a nice case because they do grow. So and that's the one when the physician comes involved, is if we can justify that the prosthetic doesn't fit for regardless if it's activity or every day. But yeah, if we can justify that there's a physical change in their either their height, weight, or their limb sizes that can show that the current prosthetic is not functional anymore, then yes, we can justify getting a new replacement. Yes, for sure. Thought I saw another hand.
That doesn't have a time limit on it then?
No, regular prosthetics would have a 3 to 5 years, but if there is a physiological change in the condition, someone gain weight or they lose weight or something happens that the current prosthetic doesn't fit, we have justification to get a new prosthetic, yeah. So there's no time limit to it. If nothing changed, then they will put a time limit from 3 to 5 years. Now, prosthetic components typically have about a 2 to 3 years warranty. So if something breaks and something needs to be replaced, we can justify for that. But when it comes to any physiological change, that is not a time limit. Saw another hand somewhere. Nope.
So what you've done through the Arkansas legislative process is nothing less than astonishing, and so I just wanted to thank you for that.
Appreciate that. It's actually Dr. Lee Johnson. I just had a conversation with him. He did the hard stuff, so he convinced the fellow lawmakers. So, but you never know who listens when you speak, so don't stop talking. Alrighty. Well, I thank you guys for having me here, and hopefully if anyone needs any information that wasn't clear, you can reach out to me. That's the references that I use, so appreciate it and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Okay, I think we're a little bit ahead of schedule, but we'll go ahead and roll into our next speaker. Our next speaker is our second keynote speaker. This is Dr. Joseph Giacino. I'd like to say a few personal comments. Went to a conference in National Association of State Head Injury Administrators, and this guy was doing a presentation. And have you ever gone to a presentation where you had all these assumptions and you go, no, and he goes, yeah, and you go, no, and he goes, yeah, again, and he shows you the proof. So I hope he doesn't mind me saying that, but it's kind of a challenge, but I think you're going to enjoy this. Dr. Giacino is the director of Spalding Rehabilitation Network. He works particularly in disorders of consciousness. He's the program director for rehab, neuropsychology, and a professor in physical medicine and rehabilitation at Harvard Medical School. He directs the Spalding Rehabilitation Network Laboratory, which develops assessment treatment methods for severe acquired brain injury and disorders of consciousness, and serves on the teaching faculty of the Center of Bioethics at the Harvard Medical School. Gives me great pleasure to present Dr. Giacino. There you go. I'll turn that off.
Yep.
And to the right is forward.
Sounds
Okay.
good.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Bircher, and I also want to thank Eddie Williams, who had the pleasure to meet at another talk that I did recently, and I'm hoping to be able to collaborate with their group on some of the work that I've been involved in. So let's get the slides up. There we go. So this is my topic for the next probably 45 minutes or so. I want to talk a little bit about the natural history of recovery from severe brain injury, really focusing on traumatic brain injury. And this is an area that is in medicine that is really contaminated, I'll use that word, with nihilism, pessimism about likelihood of recovery after severe brain injury. And it's prevalent across all groups. So I'm not talking just about the public. I'm talking also about clinicians who are involved in the care of patients with severe traumatic brain injury. And I think a big reason for this is because, and you've heard this before, because of the way we are siloed. So we have the acute space, and then we have the post-acute space. And that wall has been high and thick for a long time. Now the good news is, and I've been in this field for over 35 years now, it is really starting to come down. So we are getting a lot more crosstalk between rehab and acute care providers. And by acute care providers, I mean trauma surgeons, I mean neurocritical care, intensivists, and neurologists, more than ever before. So I'm very optimistic that things will change, but we have a lot of work to do. So I think let me not get too ahead of myself here. Quick disclosures. Another way to put the objectives up here is I really want to try to dispel some of the misperceptions about the natural history of recovery after severe traumatic brain injury by using data and evidence. There's also, a split in terms of who reads what literature. That's also changing because we're now collaborating. So we have rehab providers collaborating with surgeons, collaborating with neurointensivists. So when that happens, people start to think differently. And so what you're going to see now is evidence that I'm hoping you will be able to bring forward to all the people you interact with to start to, again, dispel some of these misperceptions and break down this nihilistic view of the natural history of recovery and outcome after severe brain injury. I'm going to utilize mostly evidence from two large traumatic brain injury networks, the TBI Model Systems Program and the TRACK TBI network. I'm just going to say a few words about each of them before we get started. So the TBI Model System Network has been around now it's going on 35 years. This is a federally funded program sponsored by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. There are 16 funded centers dotted around the country, and their job is to enroll patients with moderate to severe TBI who are admitted to their inpatient hospitals into this national database. That database is now the largest in the world. There are about 20,000 patients who have been enrolled in the database over the last 30 plus years. And those patients are followed on a fixed schedule by telephone at 1 year post-injury, 2 years post-injury, 5 years post-injury, and every 5 years after that for the rest of their life. So it's amassed a huge amount of data. There are, I think now, about 80,000 follow-ups that have been done. So all these follow-ups pour data into the national database, and it's mined to answer research questions. So a bunch of the evidence you're going to see is going to come from that network. The other network, which is newer, it's been around for about 12 years now, is the TRACK TBI network. This was originally funded by the National Institutes of Health. It was the largest ever TBI-funded project. That funding ran out, and now the Department of Defense is funding this network. There are 18 sites, academic medical centers around the US. Most of them are level 1 trauma centers that have rehabilitation hospitals associated with them. But what TRACK TBI, and you see here, so in the middle is Jeff Manley. He's a neurosurgeon at UCSF who is the administrative PI leading the whole brigade. And on the bottom are the 8 national PI or multi-PIs that run the 5 research cores that fuel this project. TRACK TBI has enrolled about 3,700 patients with TBI, from uncomplicated mild TBI all the way through patients who are in coma. But what it's out to do is to get us to a better place for understanding how to classify people with TBI. If you're in this room and you're involved in brain injury, you'll be familiar with the Glasgow Coma Scale and the Glasgow Outcome Scale. These are the two go-to tools for assessing patients with brain injury and then monitoring them over time. But they're very crude. They're very crude. But we rely on them very heavily for prognosis, for treatment planning, and it's a problem because they don't tell us much about what's going on under the hood with that person. So TRACK TBI has the richest database probably in the world now because it's collecting a ton of clinical data, plus neuroimaging data, plus blood-based biomarker data on every single person enrolled, and then is following them over time. So the initial funding was for 12 months. Now it's been extended out, and some patients are being followed out 9 years post-injury. So the bottom line is we have all these data, and what we're trying to do now is come up with a profile of the brain injury based on those data elements, the clinical data, the imaging data, and the blood-based biomarker data that will sort individuals into different groups. If we can do this, it'll be much more likely that our prognostication will become more precise and our treatment planning will be much more precise. Because, you know, you've heard the expression, no two brain injuries are alike. That's true. So we need to figure out what's different about this brain injury that mandates this treatment and not that treatment. So that's what TRACK-TBI is trying to do. Also, to set the stage for the rest of the discussion, I just want to go over this heuristic for recovery after severe brain injury. So we can think about recovery along two dimensions: cognitive recovery and then motor recovery. And the way things evolve, people start with, after they've had a severe TBI, obviously with significant impairment in both cognition and motor function. As time passes and there is progress, what happens is the breadth and the complexity of the behavior that those individuals express increases. So if we go to the bottom of that spectrum in the lower left corner, we have coma. What is coma? It is a state of unarousable unresponsiveness. The patient's eyes are continuously closed because the arousal system is not active. And if the arousal system's not turned on, there can be no self or environmental awareness. A step up from that is the so-called vegetative state, or also known as unresponsive wakefulness state. In this, at that level of function, the patient has awakened, the eyes are open, they have sleep-wake cycles, but there's still no behavioral evidence of awareness. Next step up is the minimally conscious state, relatively recently defined. These are individuals who show at least one definitive sign of conscious awareness. And I'm not going to go through those now, but they've been outlined operationally. What are the signs of conscious awareness that we should be looking for? So in minimally conscious state, there's at least one of those present. Turns out that's a big deal, because if you take two patients at the same moment in time post-injury, one is in vegetative state and the other is in minimally conscious state, the patient in minimally conscious state is going to have a better prognosis than the one in vegetative state. But that difference can often be very subtle, and we have to really be careful to look for those subtle signs of consciousness. That condition has been subdivided into so-called MCS plus and minus. MCS plus means that I mentioned there needs to be at least one definitive sign of consciousness. In MCS plus, language function is preserved. So these are individuals who show signs of being able to follow commands, meaning receptive language is working. Or they can express themselves by saying even a single word. So the language system is on. In MCS minus, there are signs of conscious awareness, but no evidence of language function. This is also starting to look like an important distinction for prognostic purposes. The individuals with MCS have a recovery course that actually looks closer to what it looks like for patients in vegetative state than patients in MCS plus. The next step up and the highest point on the disorders of consciousness ladder is emergence from minimally conscious state, or now known as the post-traumatic confusional state. People get to that point when one of two things happens. They're either able to communicate reliably at a basic yes-no level. Is your name John? Is your name Jim? That sort of thing. Or they're able to use objects in a functional manner. You know, they can comb their hair, they can self-feed, those sorts of things. That brings the person out of a minimally conscious state into this next condition, post-traumatic confusional state, but they're disoriented, floridly confused, may or may not be agitated. And then that condition ends when people regain orientation and agitation basically disappears. And then you have that hashed line, and from there we have now what's left is the disability that will be either short-term or long-term. And we divide that up, obviously, into severe disability, moderate, and mild. So that's sort of the general spectrum. All right, I'm going to organize this discussion around the three phases of recovery. And again, I'm going to be focusing on what happens in those three phases and what we should be mindful and alert to. So the acute and subacute phase, which I'm going to define here, is the first 28 days after injury. The post-acute phase, the first 12 months after injury, and then the chronic phase going out to 10 years, because we now have evidence that goes at least 1 decade out. Starting with what does recovery look like during the acute and subacute phase? A little bit of background. So this is the period when goals of care are established. The person's just had, it's day 1, just had a very severe brain injury, they're unconscious. The question that immediately comes up for the clinical team is, how aggressive should our care be? Should we save this person's life, or is this injury unsalvageable? That decision-making process begins right away. And we get to a decision about that very quickly, which I'm going to keep coming back to. This idea of, should we be aggressive in saving this person's life and then restoring function, or should we let this person go because the injury is so severe? So that's the context for this period. The problem is that when we're trying to establish a prognosis, we rely heavily, most primarily, on behavioral findings at the bedside, to a lesser extent on imaging findings and lab studies. The problem with those 3 types of indicators is they're imprecise. We don't have enough information yet, and I'll spell this out a little bit later in the talk, as to how well they work for any given person in telling us the probability of further recovery and how much recovery there will be. So we have this sort of what I'll call rush to judgment that has to be made, but we're kind of working from a disadvantaged standpoint. And then in addition to that, most clinicians, I would submit, are not very knowledgeable about the time course around behavioral recovery or functional recovery. So that's really important, because if we don't know when we should expect to see things like signs of consciousness emerge, how can we make good decisions about things like how aggressive care should be in the first 3 days after the injury? Sorry, I left off the last point, which is important. This may be new information for some of you and potentially pretty alarming. The most common cause of death after traumatic brain injury in the ICU is withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment. And that's the case across all age groups. Most people die from having life-sustaining treatments withdrawn. So I want you to keep that in mind across the rest of this discussion. So I know you can't really see these 2 tables here, but basically what they are, the table on the left is a database of 6 level 1 trauma centers in Canada. This study was published, it's a bit old now, in 2011. And the one on the right is a database from the US that looks at, it's where all of the data on level 1 trauma centers go. It's called the Trauma Quality Improvement Program database. There are over 800 trauma centers that put data into this database, accounting for about 39, almost 40,000 people. So these are 2 big databases. The upshot here is the following. What these data tell us is what I was intimating before, that about 70% of the deaths that occur in the ICU occur because somebody has made a decision to withdraw life-sustaining treatment. And the second point is that decision gets made most often, the median time, within 72 hours of the injury. Okay, so plant that in the back of your head. Let's take the first myth, at least in my view. An accurate prognosis about long-term outcome following severe TBI can be established within 72 hours of onset to guide decision-making regarding goals of care. Well, let's start to look carefully at this. This study was just published a couple months ago. Yelena Bodine from my group was the first author on this study, and it used data from Track TBI. Really interesting. This study actually got global attention, and you'll understand why in a second. So what the group did here is went into the Track TBI database, found all the patients who had life-sustaining treatment withdrawn as the cause of death. then matched that group to survivors in tract TBI who had very similar clinical and demographic characteristics. So match them up. You see on the left lower portion of the screen 3 tiers, tier 1, 2, and 3. Taking the clinical data and the demographic data, we were able to establish a propensity score, the propensity for life-sustaining treatment to be withdrawn. So if you were in tier 1, you had the lowest probability of having life-sustaining treatment withdrawn, and if you were in tier 3, you were in the highest. But again, this is done on the survivors, right? So at the end of the day, what we did here was take that group who had treatment withdrawn and died, compare them to people who were matched. They looked pretty much the same, and then match them against the severity or the propensity for having treatment withdrawn based on how severe these indicators were. And here's the upshot. 50%, and this is the survivors now, 50% of the people in tier 1 and in tier 2 by 6 months had become at least partially independent, defined as could take care of themselves independently for up to 8 hours a day. A few patients in tier 3, the most severe group, by 12 months were functioning independently. That's a really big number. So what do you take from this? Does this mean that 50% of the people who had care withdrawn may have actually made a pretty good recovery by 6 months? Well, it should give us pause to think. So that's why this got so much attention, because that is a really stunning statistic. But we shouldn't be so surprised. What you're looking at here, this is a page out of the 2018 practice guidelines for management of patients with disorders of consciousness. This was a joint effort by the American Academy of Neurology, the American Congress of Rehabilitation Medicine, and the National Institute on Disability Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, which is the federal agency that funds the TBI model systems. What you're looking at here is a list of all of the outcome predictors that have been identified as useful or as relevant to outcome in patients who have severe TBI and disturbance in consciousness. But the way they're organized is what's important. So on the top, I don't know how well you can see this. There are prognostic indicators that suggest favorable outcome and prognostic indicators that suggest unfavorable outcome. That's the first division. But then you see also along the top, moderate and low confidence. I left off high confidence. What this group did when establishing the guidelines was to figure out, based on the data, how much confidence we can have in those indicators when we're using them with an individual patient. And you do this, well, I'm not going to get into detail here, by using a statistic called the confidence interval. So you might have a predictor that says, if you have this predictor, you're one of the people who has this predictor, there's a 30% chance that you're going to die. But if the confidence interval around that goes from 2% to 85%, it's not that useful, right? Because the variability is way big to be able to apply to that individual case. That is the case for most of the predictors we have now. So we're just not at a point where we can be precise when we're making prognostic forecasts. Okay, let me shift gears. And again, we're trying to do this in the first 72 hours. So what do we know about behavioral recovery in the early phase? So this study was done by my group. We used the placebo group from a large clinical trial. So they didn't get the treatment of interest. They were just followed. So this is a good natural recovery type population. They all had very severe traumatic brain injury and all had disturbance in consciousness when they started this study. And so we asked, what we did here was to say, let's pick specific behaviors that we think are important to recovery, and let's see how they evolve over a defined period of time. The defined period of time we used was the 6-week observation window for this treatment, for this clinical trial. So patients came into the trial, and in the chart on the left, you see the 6 behaviors that we picked. Consistent command following, object recognition, I can't actually read it here, but I know them off the top. Functional object use, intelligible verbalization, reliable communication, and ability to sustain attention for 15 to 30 minutes. Those are the highest level behaviors on the Coma Recovery Scale Revised, which is the most used standardized instrument for assessing patients with disorders of consciousness. So we weren't interested in picking behaviors that find subtle signs of consciousness. We were picking behaviors that are, these are complex behaviors. To be able to consistently follow commands, answer yes, no questions, reliable. The chart on the left is the percentage of people in the blue line, or the blue bar, that had those behaviors present when we enrolled them in the study. So you can see it's 0 to 5%. The red bar, vertical bar, is the percentage of that group who had those behaviors, demonstrated those behaviors within 6 weeks of the observation window. That goes from 29 to 42%. So keep in mind, this is happening in an inpatient rehab setting. This is way past the ICU, right? So these patients didn't have these behaviors, clearly. They didn't have them at the beginning of the rehab admission. They didn't have them when they were in the acute care hospital. But they came back, one might say, with a vengeance over this next 6 weeks. We also looked at, in the figure on the right, how many of these behaviors did they get back? And as it turns out, 20% of this group got all 6 of these behaviors back within this 6-week period. And another about 10% got 5 of 6 back. All of this happening further downstream from where all the action is in critical decision making in the ICU. For each behavior recovered, the score on the disability rating scale, which is an index of degree of disability after brain injury, improved by about 2 points. And so there was actually a 12-point difference in patients who recovered all 6 of these behaviors and those who recovered none on the DRS. And the point is that's a big spread. All right, let's move to myth number 2 from the acute phase, acute subacute. Failure to demonstrate early improvement in behavioral responsiveness predicts lack of subsequent improvement. We're looking real hard in those first 72 hours. If we don't see anything happening, we start to get a little down. Everybody gets a little down, often. Should we? I'm sorry about the slides getting a little screwed up here. So let's look at this study from TBI Model System. This is a study led by Bob Kowalski, and what we did here was look at 7,500 patients in the TBI National Database who were admitted to the ED with some disturbance in consciousness, defined as weren't following commands. And then those patients were followed over the course of 12 months because the group that came forward into rehab had consistent follow-up. So what we found is that, and again, everybody comes into the ED not following commands, 7,500 of those people. During the acute hospitalization, 43% of them recovered command following. By admission to rehab, there were only 12% left not following commands. And then by the end of the rehab phase, 2% were not following commands. When you look at patients who came into rehab with disturbance in consciousness, that's the yellow line on the bottom, and compare them to patients who came into rehab without disturbance in consciousness, and you look at the slope of recovery, how much happened over the course of the rehab, the group with the yellow line, those with disorders of consciousness, had actually more absolute recovery than the group that did not have disturbance in consciousness. So this idea that, again, early lack of change predicts subsequent lack of change simply is wrong. A piece of this slide got left off. What you're looking at here, that score is the score on the functional independence measure, the FIM, which looks at self-care ability, cognitive ability, and social ability to interact socially. The blue line should have shown plus 37. The point again being more points improved on the FIM for the group with DOC than the group without. And 40% of the group with DOC by discharge from rehab was functioning at an independent level. Okay, so we've been interested, we know behavioral signs of consciousness are super important because they drive early decision making. But what do we know about the time course to their recovery? Not a lot. That's part of why we did this study. So in this study, we looked at 11 behaviors that represent signs of consciousness. These are the things we should be looking at very carefully early on to see if they're emerging, because again, the earlier one emerges, the better the outcome will be, typically. So the upshot here is that the clear winner is visual pursuit. 41% of patients demonstrate visual pursuit as the first sign of consciousness. Visual pursuit is the ability to fixate and follow a moving object or person. When somebody's fixating, tracking, that's visual pursuit. That is the most common sign. 2 and 3, at 25% reproducible command following and at 24% automatic movements. Automatic movements would be things like somebody reaches up and scratches their face, grabs an object that's laying on the bed. Those are automatic behaviors. And then all of the rest of them were much lower. So the point is those 3 behaviors are the ones we really should be on the lookout for early on and not miss, because they're telling us this person's emerging. But they're subtle signs, and if you don't carefully look for them, you're going to miss them. This is sort of one of the follow-on studies we did. So we wanted to learn a little bit about when communication ability comes back, defined as the ability to reliably answer yes and no questions. So the way this is operationally defined, again, it uses the Coma Recovery Scale. The person is asked 6 questions. It's actually 3 questions in two different ways. Is your name Jim? Is your name Bill? Are you sitting in a bathtub? Are you sitting in a chair? So those kinds of questions. And we're looking for, reliable communication is getting all 6 right. It's a high bar. So why did we pick on this behavior? Because in 2 different studies now of focus groups with family members, they tell us the most important outcome for them when somebody is unconscious is to be able to communicate with them. That's not so surprising. That is the number 1 outcome for a family member. Kind of meaning that that's what they value. It's kind of the minimally acceptable outcome, one might say. So what we found here is that 52% of the, I think it's about 175 people that were in this study, none of whom were able to communicate initially on admission to rehab, 52% within 8 weeks. Our program is an 8-week program. Within 8 weeks, recovered the ability to communicate reliably. And that's a really complex function. Language has to work, problem solving has to work. You need a lot of intact brain to be able to answer yes or no questions reliably. So that's a lot of recovery in a, again, relatively short time frame, but it's all happening well past the key decision-making period of those first few days. So what do we take from this? As I said, critical prognostic decisions are generally made within 72 hours of injury, but this is before the window for recovery of these key behaviors that are, first of all, functionally meaningful, but also going to tell us about the likelihood of subsequent recovery. What we know from the evidence is that more than 80% of patients with disorders of consciousness that persist across the ICU stay ultimately recover consciousness by rehab discharge. Why rehab discharge? Because we were able to follow them, because they were a captive audience. But this is really related to the general time course. I'm not making a case to say rehab made the difference. Maybe it did, but I don't know that, and we didn't test that. The point is, this happened later. About 20% of patients who remain in a vegetative or minimally conscious state for 6 weeks, that's a long time in our world, recover a cluster of complex behaviors like being able to speak intelligibly, communicate reliably, but those things may not start to emerge until 10 weeks post-injury. About 50% of people admitted to inpatient rehab with disorders of consciousness go on to recover functional communication, usually within the first 3 months. And that interesting fact that patients who have disorders of consciousness actually show greater absolute improvement than people who don't. They start lower, they're more impaired, they end more impaired, but they improve a lot. So that's the takeaway here. Okay, let's move on to the post-acute phase. I forgot to set my timer, so Dr. Bircher or somebody's going to wave when I get to like 10 minutes. Hopefully I'm not there yet. Okay, what happens over this first year, between 28 days and 12 months? So a little bit of background here to set the stage. Lots of stuff's going on in the brain that brings about spontaneous recovery. But if we lift the hood a little bit, where does spontaneous recovery come from? So there are a number of neurobiological mechanisms that have been defined that account for why people get better on their own, what the brain is actually doing on its own. And these are 4, I'm not going to get into detail here, but one is called reversal of diaskesis. Diaskesis is this interesting phenomenon that happens whereby an undamaged area of the brain downregulates. It sort of stops functioning, not because it's injured, but because it's connected to another part of the brain that is injured, right? The brain is full of connections. That's what keeps us going and allows us to be complex creatures. So a damaged area of brain connected to an undamaged area of the brain causes problems in both areas. Reversal of diaskesis occurs when that undamaged portion starts to reactivate, which it will do over time on its own. It starts to restore function. Restitution is the process, as PTs will appreciate this, and I'm sure rely on this heavily. Restitution is changes in synaptic connectivity, the connections between neurons that occur from repetition and rehearsal, doing something over and over. So balance retraining, which PTs are wizards at. How do they get people to get better? They keep putting them through the paces of learning how to catch your balance and different uneven surfaces, et cetera. By doing that, you're actually building synaptic strength, and that improves function. Redundancy, areas of the brain that have a secondary role in mediating a particular function, not a primary role, can ramp up and take over some of the function that the primary area was responsible for, but it's damaged, it can't do its job, so now the secondary structures or portions of the brain take on a bigger role. And then vicariation is similar, where an area of the brain that didn't have anything to do with a particular function actually steps in to support some of that function. So these are all the different neurobiological processes that are going on. We don't know in any given patient which ones are happening and which ones aren't. It's very likely that multiple processes are going on, but it no doubt accounts for the variability in what we see and makes it that much more difficult to predict a single person's outcome, because there's no way for us to index those processes that are going on simultaneously, or maybe going on simultaneously. All right, myth 3. Spontaneous recovery rapidly trails off after the first 3 months post-injury. I'm sure you've heard this before. Let's look at that. Let's look at some evidence. So this is a track TBI study that Mike McCrae at the Medical College of Wisconsin and I led. So we went into the database and we pulled out 362 patients with severe TBI, And we looked at the trajectory of recovery of that group using the Glasgow Outcome Scale Extended and a bunch of secondary measures, including the Disability Rating Scale, which also looks at global function but puts greater emphasis on cognition than does the Glasgow Outcome Scale. And then a number of other measures that were symptom self-report measures and cognitive performance tests. But I'm going to focus in on the primary measure, which is the Glasgow Outcome Scale. So what did we find? Remember I told you that, well, maybe I didn't tell you. So TRACK-TBI assesses patients at 2 weeks, 3 months post-injury, 6 months post-injury, 12 months post-injury. So we had all these data that we could look at. So if you look at 2 weeks, if you look at the 2 weeks, actually I don't have a marker for 2 weeks, but if you look at 2 weeks and you look at the top bracket, 12% of people by 2 weeks had gotten to a Glasgow Outcome Scale score of 4 or greater. What's the significance of that 4? It's again, they can be home on their own for up to 8 hours a day functioning independently. Most people would say that's a pretty damn good outcome for somebody who was not conscious earlier. About 12% get there within 2 weeks. That's pretty impressive to begin with. But by 12 months, it's over 50% that have gotten at least to that point in their recovery. So that's a bunch of recovery that's occurring over the course of the first year. When we look at, this is the same data set, but now the disability rating scale scores a little bit differently. 19% of people at 12 months in this group reported no disability, and another 14% reported only mild disability by 12 months. We homed in on the most severe people in the group, those in vegetative state at 2 weeks. And we asked what happened to them over time. Well, the bottom line is that by 12 months, out of the 68 people who were in a vegetative state at 2 weeks, 1 was still in a vegetative state, hadn't recovered consciousness by 12 months. So the bottom line is most people will recover, if they survive, will recover from a vegetative state. And I don't think people think in those terms, especially when somebody has remained unconscious across the ICU stay, and even into rehab. So the problem is that the clinicians tend to overestimate the likelihood of poor outcome during the post-acute phase. That negatively biases decision-making about patient care. The evidence that we can use to contest this is the great majority of those who survive even vegetative state go on to recover consciousness within 12 months. Between week 2 and 12 months post-injury, the percentage of people who achieve a favorable outcome, again, can get to a point of independent function, quadruples over the first 12 months. 50 to 75% go on to become partially or fully functionally independent. All right, last part. What about the chronic phase? We have relatively few studies that have even followed patients with severe TBI longer than 12 months. So that really limits our ability to understand the incidence of late recovery. Studies that have done so have used fairly crude measures that are not going to be able to detect subtle but important behaviors that predict subsequent outcome or actually are functionally meaningful. So we're working sort of from a deficit, but we have some studies that have been very informative here. So the myth for the chronic phase is that spontaneous recovery plateaus after a year. This is a very popular one. You have a year to get better, and that's it. So the TBI model system has been following the same cohort of about 110 people for 10 years. Same people, the same way, on the same schedule. All of these individuals had disturbance in consciousness defined as no command following initially. So the paper in the middle is the report of what happened from year 1 to year 5. That was led by John White, and the paper on the right, led by Flora Hammond in the model systems, was year 5 to year 10. All of the data were, the primary outcome measure was the functional independence measure, 3 different domain scores, how well is the person doing in self-care, mobility, and cognition, and it goes from, again, completely dependent to completely independent. So what do we take from this? It's busy, but I'll break it down. So the top right panel, what you're looking at are the percentage of people who had no command following after they were admitted to rehab, but got command following back during the inpatient rehab stay. What percentage of them became independent at 4 time points? The blue line on the bottom, the light blue line on the bottom, by rehab discharge. And then the red, green, and purple lines are by 1 year, by 2 years, by 5 years post-injury. So what's the takeaway? For the group that recovered command following during inpatient rehab, so the blue line on the bottom, about 10 to 20% recovered those behaviors, at least some of them, by the time they were discharged from rehab. But look what happens by 1 year and then going to 2 and 3 years. Now we're talking about 60 to 80% of those individuals are independent in these FIM behaviors around self-care, cognition, and communication, et cetera. The panel on the bottom right, those are individuals who didn't recover consciousness during inpatient rehab. What happened? So their blue line is right on the bottom. You can't even see it because they were all zeros. Nobody was independent because they didn't recover consciousness. But even here, 10 to 20% of that group have, within 1, 2, and 5 years, recovered independence. If we look to the right, these are the data from 5 years to 10 years. What the first part of this study used trajectory modeling to say, do we have different trajectories of recovery? And this study found 4 different subgroups. They were defined differently, but the point I want to make here is that 2 of the 4 subgroups, the yellow and the blue subgroups, showed substantial improvement, defined here as recovered functional independence, between 5 and 10 years post-injury. So now it's a smaller percentage of people, but we're out a decade and we're still seeing improvements that are very meaningful improvements. All right. So again, I started with this premise of we have all this prognostic and therapeutic nihilism to deal with, but the evidence says that the majority of patients who survive acute hospitalization but remain unable to follow commands ultimately achieve independence in self-care, mobility, and cognitive functions. Recovery of functional independence continues out to 10 years in a substantial proportion of patients. And there's no evidence of a pattern of deterioration, interestingly, in this population, which is really interesting. So what can we take back from clinical practice? Danny, how much time? 10 now? Oh, okay, so I'm good. A couple things. Some of these are drawn from the guidelines that I mentioned. So if you go to the AAN, ACRM, NIDLR prognostic guidelines, you'll see some of these in there because I've taken them straight from there. So the first lesson to be learned is we should be using standardized neurobehavioral assessment measures for patients to detect conscious awareness, that are able to detect these subtle behaviors. Because studies have time and time again shown that going to the bedside using a standardized assessment scale is more precise, is more accurate than going to the bedside and doing your own made-up examination, which still is the most prevalent way that people get assessed in the ICU. It's a clinician who has their PAT exam, do their exam, whatever that may be, maybe given a couple commands and making a decision based on that, doing some reflex testing, and done. That's not going to do it. We should be using standardized assessment measures. There's a highly cited study that found that 40% of patients who were pronounced unconscious from qualitative bedside exam actually retained conscious awareness when they were reassessed using a standardized assessment instrument. The other thing that we should really do all the time is avoid a one-off examination. patients with disorders of consciousness early fluctuate. So a patient may actually have clear evidence of command following at moment 1, and then 5 minutes later, you can't get it again. Because the brain is oscillating. It's sick, it's damaged. It doesn't maintain stability. So it's oscillating up and down. So if you happen to go into the bedside to do your consultation and you catch the brain while it's oscillated down, you're not going to find the highest level of behavior that person's capable of. How do you combat that? By repeating the exam serially over time. So I didn't cover it today, but there's a very robust study that now has really become the guide that we use that says if you do a single examination, you're going to miss consciousness when it's present 36% of the time. That's almost 4 out of 10 people will be pronounced unconscious when they actually retain consciousness. If you repeat the exam 5 times on the same person, you lower that misdiagnosis rate to 5%. So we should be doing serial standardized assessment. When discussing prognosis with caregivers, during the first 28 days, we should avoid statements that suggest a definitively poor prognosis, for all the reasons I just covered. We just don't have that level of confidence and certainty. And we know that downstream, a few weeks later, there's going to be more recovery. That's going to be obvious. The person's going to express themselves for the first time as having the capacity to recover because those behaviors will emerge later. When discussing prognosis in general, we should be tying outcome prediction to specific indicators. But I think the emphasis here, point of emphasis is we need to disclose how much uncertainty we have around the prognostic statements we're making and let the family sort of grapple with that rather than saying, we're confident this will be a poor recovery because of all these things. So all of this, I think, kind of then comes to a head and suggests we should be deferring this rush to judgment. This 72-hour window that we make the most grave decision that can be made about a human being, it's too early for all the reasons I've covered. Among those who do survive the injury, this is sort of an ancillary point. Most of the deaths that are going to occur, not from withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment, but from the injury, are going to happen during the acute hospitalization anyway. So if we can lengthen that and just allow nature to take its course, that will sort of sort out the people who just aren't going to be able to get better. They're going to die. It's not like people are dying for 6 months out, 8 months out. They're dying. The course of injury for those who are destined to not survive is going to happen pretty quickly. But again, the other point is that those behavioral signs are just not going to express themselves early enough to be able to use that as a prognostic indicator or in the decision-making algorithm that you want to discuss with a family member. Okay, so I might end on this. This encapsulates everything I said, but what is that? That's the 2011 Atlantic hurricane season prediction map. I stole this slide from Joe Finns, who's a bioethicist at Cornell, a good friend of mine. And so basically what this is you're looking at the predicted hurricane season back in 2011. And all those dotted lines are all the different models that were saying what was likely to happen in the hurricane season. But it's at the beginning of the season, right? There's a lot of uncontrolled variables. So the models are all over the place. You've got some paths that are not coming anywhere near landmass, and then other paths that are clearly crossing landmass. That's a mess, right? We don't really know what's going to happen. But over time, as we allow time to unfold, and if you're thinking weather-wise, 24 hours before, those models would be tight, right? We would really get a sense of the likelihood of landfall. But that's what we're dealing with prognostication after severe brain injury. We can't, it looks like this in the first 24 hours. If we could wait it out a bit, we'd get a lot more consistency and predictability. So this is kind of what I want to leave you with to summarize this. All right, I'm going to stop here because I think if there's some questions, I'm happy to take them, and I'll run out of time if I do the last thing. So thank you very much. That was a lot of stuff. So happy to take some questions.
Okay, I have two questions. The first one is there any research as far as imaging, like MRI, CT scans?
I'm sorry, could you start
That's
one
okay.
more time?
My question is more about the groups and some of the studies. Is there any like imaging, CT scans, MRIs, a comparison of here they were in the ICU and then 1 year, 2 years, 5 years later, or is it all just the standardized test?
Is it all, I didn't hear the last part.
This test, the standardized test that y'all are
No,
using?
no, and I don't mean to say by any means that imaging is not important, is not helpful. It definitely is. So track TBI, this is one of its focuses, actually really sharpening our ability to use neuroimaging. But the point is that I don't think you can look at a scan and, I mean, look, it depends on what you want to predict. It's probably possible to look at a scan early, and if you see, diffuse bihemispheric damage involving going all the way down to the brainstem, I can probably make a prediction that this person is not going to become functionally independent. But first of all, that doesn't happen that often, to have that significant of an injury to show up on the scan early. So the point is, I think we just have to, that's one data element that has to be added in. We couldn't take, the other thing, I think this is the meat of your question, can't really look at a scan from point 1 and point 2 and say, oh, this scan is improved by 20%, so that means that has this much of an impact on that person's outcome. Actually, that relationship doesn't, it's very nonlinear. You can see people who have had really good functional recovery who have pretty crappy looking scans down the line. And then you have people who have not had very good functional recovery who their scans look pretty good, or they improved over time. So it's not a good indicator by itself, but add it into, I mean, look, we're gonna eventually have AI to help us here. So all of these data elements I'm talking about, I think for every track TBI patient, we have something like over 2,000 data elements. We can't handle that right now. No clinician can handle that. AI can handle that. We're not at a point yet, but eventually we will be able to feed all this information into AI, and it's gonna be able to give us a much more precise idea of what downstream outcome is gonna look like. Did I get to your question?
I'm a 12-year out brain injury survivor. I'm not traumatic, it's anoxic acquired. But when I got discharged from 2 years of speech therapy, I had to go back for an evaluation with my psychologist and my speech therapist and run all these tests or do all these deals. And I'm sure there's records of that. So being 12 years out, if I had to go back and do that again, what would it be like? Would I be better, worse, same? Is that a bad question?
That's a great question, right? And it goes to the first question to some extent. Because I think I would say to you, so my inclination would be that if you got retested now, relative to your test scores from 12 years ago, I would imagine them to be significantly better.
Better.
Right. But how much better? And is the incremental change on your test scores consistent with the incremental change in your life function?
Right.
Right? Because that answer might be no. We might see, I don't know, I'm making it up, 20% improvement or 30% improvement, but you're sitting here asking me a very smart question.
Right.
And when you were in the hospital after your anoxic brain injury, your level of function probably was nowhere near that.
I couldn't write the alphabet.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
okay. All right, thanks.
Yeah, did you have a question? Just a quick question. Is all of this data drawn from adults, or are there some pediatric individuals in here, and is there variability between adults and pediatric patients?
Super good question, and I'm remiss for not having made that clear. These are all adults that I presented. Track TBI does have a pediatric cohort. Those data are not as curated as these data are, so the good news is that Track TBI just sort of restarted its pediatric data collection. Now it has a bunch of new top shelf programs with pediatric cases. So I think we're going to start to see the kind of data I just showed you for adults for kids relatively soon. Your question about how analogous, I'll rephrase it, how analogous would the adult data be to the pediatric data? I'm not sure that they're that analogous, but we don't know. Now, I will say that up to this point, from what we know, and we have limited pediatric data, for disorders of consciousness, people generally say, well, if a kid gets injured early, their prognosis for a favorable outcome is better than if it's an adult. And that may well be true for less severe injuries. I'm not sure the evidence supports that for people who have a prolonged disturbance in consciousness. Kids, I don't know that they do much better than adults. At a lesser injury level, they probably do because of the plasticity, is greater for an earlier injury than a later injury. But more to come for sure. Yeah.
I just wanted to say thank you for all the information you presented today. I can attest to that nihilism. My first job, I'm a physical therapist assistant, and my first job was at a brain injury recovery rehab in New York. New York State has a program where TBI patients can receive up to a year of therapy. It's like a Medicaid-based program.
The waiver program.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now living in Arkansas, that program doesn't exist. And my question really is like how, and it was like very difficult to see patients with lack of resources. And I wanted to know like how much did the patient's ability to have resources factor into their recovery?
Yeah, I wish I could answer that question. I'm going to give you a non-answer, but it'll get around so I'm from Massachusetts, and I work in Boston. It's a rich state with one of the best healthcare systems in the country, hands down. I can't get patients into an outpatient brain injury program because they don't exist in my state. That when I've been there almost 15 years, they did when I got there, they closed because payers wouldn't pay for them. So I'm dealing all the time with people who had, our level 1 trauma centers provide, for the most part, world-class care. We save people's lives that have, forgive the way I'm going to, have no business being saved. That sounds not the way I want to say it. You get my point, though. The point is that heroic saves. They get into rehab, we do a really good job with rehab, and then they fall off a cliff. And how many, by the way, anybody know what the percentage of people with moderate to severe TBI who get into inpatient rehab is in this country? It's about 12%. Dr. Bircher presented that slide where he showed the trend where you see that shift away from inpatient rehab to long-term care facilities, home, absolutely is what's been happening. I'm involved in a lot of advocacy efforts these days. I don't have a lot longer left in my career, but if I can get one more big one, it's going to be trying to get this access problem better positioned than it is now. And I will say we're in the best position now to do that. We actually have to go after Medicare. Part of this is related to the so-called 3-hour rule, where you don't get admitted to inpatient rehab unless you can actively participate. You're deemed to be able to actively participate in 3 hours a day of PT/OT speech. And I think orthotics and prosthetics is included in that. If you have a disorder of consciousness or a severe brain injury, you're not able to actively participate in 3 hours a day. So you're out, right? You're out right out of the gate. And payers are very happy with that. They're not saddled with the cost. It costs a lot of money to, provide that level of care. And so the family has to take this on right away. The programs weren't getting paid, and so they closed shop, and it's a mess right now. But again, I don't have enough time there's some good things happening, including the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine have really gotten behind this. And my place, the Spalding Harvard TBI model system, is going to be conducting, I should actually tell you all this, is going to be conducting a virtual summit on November 22nd. If you go, eventually, it's not on our website yet, but it's going to be around getting CMS policy language changed. There's going to be 2 events. They're 2 weeks apart. Our event, and then on December 4th, a healthcare policy consulting firm from Washington, D.C., very well-known firm led by the former head of the Department of Health and Human Services, will be doing a workshop that follows our summit on this rethinking of the 3-hour rule. Ultimately, what we want to happen is we want to rewrite the language so it doesn't knock out of the picture patients with severe brain injury. But that's a tall task, but it's going to happen. And the National Academy of Science and Engineering and Medicine are actually helping us do this. So we're better positioned now to get some change than we have been. I don't know if it's going to happen, but better positioned now than any prior time in my career anyway. Yeah.
I had a quick statement from the VA. I work at
Could
the
you
VA.
just raise your hand? I don't know where. Oh, okay, sorry.
I work at the VA. I've worked there for more than 40 years, and I would tell you from my experience, I've had an 18-year-old that's now 63, and he has recovered cognitively every year. He's not recovered physically every year, but he's improved cognitively every year. So I do think a long period of time, if you've watched, we do 18 to grave at our facility, so if you watch someone a really long time, they do well. They do better than you would actually ever believe. But having said that, just a little bit more expansion on if the person is older when they have the injury, do like 18 versus 45 versus 65, if you had anything toward that. And just a plug for anybody else that wants to come to the VA, we have a great concussive program, we have a great brain injury program, and we treat people with all the equipment that they need. So it's just a real unique environment, like for the prosthetics things and the concussive studies. Have you got anything specifically that you might have touched on that the VA is doing or that they have done longer term? We've been with the FEM forever.
Well, I think the first thing I would say about the VA is that it's not the health system in the U.S. It's what I'd love the health system in the U.S. to be, right? Because you are a single payer, right? So you're on the line from start to finish. That's the problem with our system. There's no one payer who is holding the bag. If there was, they'd be paying attention and they'd really want to do what is most efficient, most effective, early on investing resources, but we don't have that. We have a passing off, right? You start with maybe a commercial payer, then it goes on to Medicare or Medicaid, and but the VA system, you don't have that problem, and it is, I think, why some of those outcomes are better, because you're able to perform, good treatment for a longer period of time consistently. I think your question about age, there has been a relative neglect of older individuals with TBI. That's changing too now because they're now the number one group, individuals over the age of, I think it's 50, who get TBI because of falls. So I just got an email this week, again from the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and they are advertising a workshop on geriatric TBI to sort of start to get to some of the issues that have to be addressed with the care system. So you can go online, just go to National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and I think you can put in geriatric TBI, and you should be able to get information about that. I just saw the announcement this week.
This kind of ties into the question before last, but I've been a PT in acute care and in inpatient rehab, and The theme in the hospital right now kind of seems to get patients out as quickly as possible, push them out, push them out, push them out. And so I was curious if you felt like some of your research could be a basis for getting our patients more rehab days, especially those severe TBIs, kind of like the way you talked about changing the 3-hour rule. Do you feel like we could use this as a base?
Absolutely. Actually, what I didn't show you, I'm not going to get into this now, but what we've done is we collect data systematically every day in clinical care. We set the program up that way. And so now we have in our EPIC system, our electronic health record, all these data go directly into that system. And now we're developing data visualization dashboards that basically show recovery trends and, which is really important for teaching our colleagues about how people recover, also sitting with family members and even with payers. So I think the bottom line is the onus is on us to take the evidence that I just showed you and sit down with your colleagues on the neurocritical care side, on the trauma side. And when I came to Mass General Hospital, I was not a known entity at all. I got up in front of neurointensivists and presented not all these data because we didn't have all, but a lot of this stuff, and I was watching the jaws drop to the floor of these neurologists, and it was because they had never seen these data, because then that's not their world. They're going to listen, is the point. You just have to educate. Educate is number one. So I think that's on us. We haven't done a great job of educating our colleagues, partly because we haven't done a great job of talking, like this whole silo thing. We got to break that down. But I think I would urge you to have this conversation, pull the guidelines. There are a number of things available now publicly. Pull the DOC guidelines. There's another set of standards for programs that provide services to persons with disorders of consciousness that's published in the Archives of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. So there are resources that you can use as tools, basically. Okay, well, thank you all again. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great trip.
Thank you.
That was great. So we're up against another break here, and so we've got sugar for you, and we got warm cookies, and so at least that, I know it's going to be a long day, but we will come back as scheduled at 3:30 for our next speaker. Okay, y'all.